self-consecration. Reading through the first chapter, Four Aids, we saw that Sri Aurobindo placed an entire inner emphasis on what it is that helps us practice the yoga. The teaching comes from inside, from above, from the eternal Veda. The utsaha that drives us is born from the soul and eventually burns away all the impurities in the outer nature if we permit it. The nature of the teacher is that our relationship with the Jagat Guru, with the he, she who leads the world, starts from the very core of our being. And we can commune with that teacher and imbibe that teaching and find the resources by which we can be successful in yoga, all from inside. We need no externalities to achieve good fruit in the practice of yoga. Finally, there's the measurement of time, which is a subjective reality for us, because time is experienced as an obstacle when our ego is paramount and is perceived as a helper, that which shows us the difficulties, what we must do in the warp and woof of things. Time is not our enemy. The soul ultimately has no enemies. In this second chapter, self-consecration, we see that Sri Aurobindo has again made many, many changes to the text as it was published in the Arya in 1915. It was published on the 15th of February, and a week later, Mira and Paul Richard left for France from Pondicherry at the invitation of the French government to Paul, because he was being called for service in World War I. He had made enemies by his association with known rebellious elements living in Pondicherry, most principally Sri Aurobindo. And the French were not immune to the entreaties of the British to act if they could. So the French did, in fact, call upon Paul Richard in January, and then made a quite clear demand that he depart immediately for France in February. So this issue that we see in front of us was the last to be published with a French version, because when Paul and Mira left, no one was left to translate all 64 pages of philosophy. And in fact, as Sri Aurobindo ironically noted later, after their departure, he was left to write 64 pages of philosophy by his lonely self. It is interesting that self-consecration would be the chapter that he gives to Mother upon her departure. He did not call her mother then, nobody did. But he clearly had, as he would say years later, a deep regard for her from the first moment that he saw her. Saw that she had a unique capacity to surrender all the way to the cells of her body. He had never seen that in anyone else. So perhaps he wrote this around the time that Richard got the first notice from the French government that he was to return. Perhaps it's a synchronicity, or perhaps he drafted this as a continuation of that first, in which we are talking about inner realities. So if she had to leave Pondicherry physically, she would not leave him in spiritual space. She would continue to abide with him. And in fact, she said, years later that when she departed from Pondicherry, she left her soul there. Her soul refused to go back. Paul Richard had the memory that, once we left Pondicherry, we turned our attention to Europe and the war and everything. You read her prayers and meditations, you can see how much she was still fixed on the inner life that had commenced afresh when she got to Pondicherry and sat by the side of Sri Aurobindo. So let's bear in mind what self-consecration will mean in this larger context. And before we begin, we may as well get the Latin out of the way. Consecrare, to make holy, sacred. From sacer, what is sacred? It means something that is given, of a sacred nature. The term sacrifice comes from the same root. So self-consecration is an offering of oneself. What is the meaning of to consecrate? To make sacred. What is the meaning of self-consecration? To make oneself sacred. And that gets back to the idea of entirety, because which self are we? Are we simply the self in our inner being, or are we all of what we are, body, life, and mind? And so we look for an equivalent in Sanskrit for this term, what is consecrated. And interestingly, it is Sanskrita. Sanskrit means well and beautifully made, but it also means what has been sanctified, what is hallowed, what is sacred. Because of its perfection, it has achieved integrity, and so it is true. So we begin now. All yoga is in its nature a new birth. It is a birth out of the ordinary, the mentalized material life of man, into a higher spiritual consciousness and a greater and diviner being. No yoga can be successfully undertaken and followed unless there is a strong awakening to the necessity of that larger spiritual existence. The soul that is called to this deep and vast inward change may arrive in different ways to the initial departure. It may come to it by its own natural development, which has been leading it unconsciously towards the awakening. It may reach it through the influence of a religion or the attraction of a philosophy. It may approach it by a slow illumination or leap to it by a sudden touch or shock. It may be pushed or led to it by the pressure of outward circumstances, or by an inward necessity, by a single word that breaks the seals of the mind, or by long reflection, by the distant example of one who has trod the path, or by contact and daily influence. According to the nature and the circumstances, the call will come. So, we can, through our personal growth, awaken to this. The conceptive powers of philosophy and religion may draw us. An illumined word somewhere may spark, incite the movement inside of us. And some will see a figure like Sri Aurobindo and be drawn to the example, feel the power of the persuasive image, have the inner shock of recognition through that. But in some happy few, all these combine, and there is a signal moment, an auspicious hour, a Brahma Muhurta, in which all comes together. And suddenly, the path before one is secure and is illuminated, and the context in which one works is clear, and the mission beckons. But in whatever way it comes, there must be a decision of the mind and the will, and as its result, a complete and effective self-consecration. The acceptance of a new spiritual idea force and upward orientation in the being, and illumination, a turning or conversion seized on by the will and the heart's aspiration. This is the momentous act which contains, as in a seed, all the results that the yoga has to give. So that thing in us that sees and says, yes. The turning, the conversion. Mother spoke about the essential need for a conversion of the consciousness. When things outside no longer call, are no longer desirable, they're playthings, piling up goods on the gross material plane, no longer is an adventure worth pursuing, but instead the richness of the inner dialogue with the real that calls you to it, that displaces all else. That conversion of consciousness, when we begin to live from inside out, when we are soulward in motion and not driven to pursue externalities, that, and a turning. Remember, in Greek, crisis means turning point. Kriseis means turning point. You reach a point where this life no longer is satisfactory, but you're invited to a higher level. And what happens if one fails to accept what the soul wishes is a matter that Sri Aurobindo takes up in a page or so. Contains, as in a seed, all the results that the yoga has to give. The divine asks a question. The divine, as we've noted before, he who has chosen the infinite, he who chooses the infinite has been chosen by the infinite. And in other contexts, the mythology of India is replete with examples of how the gods above watch humanity to see who is open, and they put a touch here. They ignite a fire. They illuminate with lightning. They come to you in whatever way is receptive to your nature to try to stir you to go farther. They are helpmates in that way. Whether later they are jealous of your further growth is another matter, but they watch and encourage. The mere idea or intellectual seeking of something higher beyond, however strongly grasped by the mind's interest, is ineffective unless it is seized on by the heart as the one thing desirable and by the will as the one thing to be done. For truth of the spirit has not to be merely thought, but to be lived. And to live it demands a unified single-mindedness of the being. So great a change as is contemplated by the yoga is not to be effected by a divided will or by a small portion of the energy or by a hesitating mind. He who seeks the divine must consecrate himself to God and to God only. unified single-mindedness, ekagrata, a term that we see in the Yoga Sutras. When all of our conscious being is concentrated on a single thing. But here Sri Aurobindo goes beyond what Patanjali is referring to in terms of the totality of the nature. Sri Aurobindo wants body, life, and mind in alignment, securely pursuing this one path. Note, too, that in the Arya, he closed this sentence by referring to that impersonal reality. He has deliberately come to describe here the personal Godhead. This argument between the personal and the impersonal, goes on and on forever in philosophy. Advaita Vedanta presumes only an abstract oneness, a real being, devoid of personality. And of course, all the devotional religions rely upon that as a being, a conscious person that we can aspire to, who reaches out and helps us. And in fact, there can be no world teacher unless there is such a personality. Now, in Sri Aurobindo, both had been realized. He realized the blowing out of personality in Brahmic Nirvana. And then he came later to recognize that the entire universe is inhabited by a single Godhead who has a personhood and who can relate to you in any form that is friendly to you, and then will invite you to discover him in all forms. But here, he has deliberately placed a personal deity in substitution for the impersonal reality. Not that they are at war, but it is interesting to see. If the change comes suddenly and decisively by an overpowering influence, there is no further essential or lasting difficulty. The choice follows upon the thought, or is simultaneous with it, and the self-consecration follows upon the choice. The feet are already set upon the path, even if they seem at first to wander uncertainly, and even though the path itself may be only obscurely seen, and the knowledge of the goal may be imperfect. The secret teacher, the inner guide, is already at work, though he may not yet manifest himself, or may not yet appear in the person of his human representative. Whatever difficulties and hesitations may ensue, they cannot eventually prevail against the power of the experience that has turned the current of the life. The call, once decisive, stands. The thing that has been born cannot eventually be stifled, even if the force of circumstances prevents a regular pursuit or a full practical self-consecration from the first. Still, the mind has taken its bent and persists and returns with an ever-increasing effect upon its leading preoccupation. There is an ineluctable persistence of the inner being, and against it circumstances are in the end powerless, and no weakness in the nature can for long be an obstacle. The call, once decisive, stands. The thing that has been born cannot eventually be stifled. You'll remember that Arjuna asks the question of Krishna in the Bhagavad Gita. When he sees the enormity of the yogic challenge that Krishna is telling him, he says, well, what happens if you fail? You're taking steps towards it, but you fail. You get never the fruit that you sought, and you get always the bad that you left behind. So what will happen if I fail in the quest? And Krishna, this occurs in chapter 6. I think the question is phrased in shlokas 37 and 38. And then Krishna answers lengthily to reassure him. And he says in closing that nothing is lost, that What will happen is that because of your aspiration, you will proceed to yet another existence which will be happier, with circumstances that will tend to produce what you want to work upon so that you can continue to advance. And in the last two verses, the yogin, he says, is greater than the doers of ascesis, the tapasvis, greater than the men of knowledge, the jnanis, greater than the men of works, karmibhyas. So, you become the yogin, O Arjuna. And of all yogins, he who with all his inner self, antaratma, is given to me, for me has love and faith, him I hold to be most united with me in yoga. So beyond those of knowledge, beyond those who were toughing it out, renouncing the world and aspiring through great difficulty to achieve, the one who is filled with love for the divine. And what is this bhajate that it speaks about? Attachment to. We think of it as being simply the sentimental, emotional, heartfelt love that we feel, but it is actually the full attachment to. You see, that's the power of reunion. That which has seemingly drifted away comes back into mergence with, in deep communion with. We'll find out later in the 18th chapter of the Gita that what Krishna is really talking about is the discovery of this experience of oneness at all levels of the being. In mind it is knowledge, in heart it is love, and in action it is consecrated work. It is work in communion with the divine, but it is oneness at all levels, harmonized in all our being, same reality. Ineluctable, it's a great word, isn't it? Ineluctable means inescapable. Eluctare, can't get away from the struggle. There is an ineluctable persistence of the inner being. It's not going to give up. And this last sentence, there's an ineluctable persistence of the inner being, and against its circumstances are in the end powerless, and no weakness in the nature can for long be an obstacle, he added in his revision of this chapter. As an additional assurance to those who read. Try, make the effort. It won't be for naught. But this is not always the manner of the commencement. The sadhaka is often led gradually, and there is a long space between the first turning of the mind and the full ascent of the nature to the thing towards which it turns. There may at first be only a vivid intellectual interest, a forcible attraction towards the idea, and some imperfect form of practice. Or perhaps there is an effort not favored by the whole nature, a decision or a turn imposed by the intellectual influence, or dictated by personal affection and admiration for someone who is himself consecrated and devoted to the highest. In such cases, a long period of preparation may be necessary before there comes the irrevocable consecration. And in some instances, it may not come. There may be some advance. There may be a strong effort, even much purification, and many experiences other than those that are central or supreme. But the life will either be spent in preparation, or a certain stage having been reached, the mind pushed by an insufficient driving force, may rest content at the limit of the effort possible to it. Or there may be, or there may even be a recoil to the lower life, what is called in the ordinary parlance of yoga, a fall from the path. This lapse happens because there is a defect at the very center. The intellect has been interested, the heart attracted, the will has strung itself to the effort, but the whole nature has not been taken captive by the divine. It has only acquiesced in the interest, the attraction, or the endeavor. There has been an experiment, perhaps even an eager experiment, but not a total self-giving to the imperative need of the soul or to an unforsakable ideal. Even such imperfect yoga has not been wasted, for no upward effort is made in vain. Even if it fails in the present, or arrives only at some preparatory stage or preliminary realization, it has yet determined the soul's future. But if we desire to make the most of the opportunity that this life gives us, if we wish to respond adequately to the call we have received, and to attain to the goal we have glimpsed, not merely advance a little towards it, it is essential that there should be an entire self-giving. The secret of success in yoga is to regard it not as one of the aims to be pursued in life, but as the one and only aim, not as an important part of life, but as the whole of life. Now, Sri Aurobindo is thinking here of what will be recorded in the book The Mother in chapters 1, 3, and 5. This is a theme that often comes up in the actual practice of the yoga in the ashram. Remember, that book was written for those who are going to be living around him and then later disseminated more widely. So this is the core for success, to give oneself. I pause because the next section, which I would very much like to complete if we take it up, is a little bit long, and I've already taken half an hour of your time. Let's go forward. I rely on your forgiveness. And since yoga is in its essence a turning away from the ordinary material and animal life led by most men, from the more mental but still limited way of living followed by the few to a greater spiritual life, to the way divine, every part of our energies that is given to the lower existence in the spirit of that existence is a contradiction of our aim and our self-dedication. On the other hand, every energy or activity that we can convert from its allegiance to the lower and dedicate to the service of the higher is so much gained on our road, so much taken from the powers that oppose our progress. An important point, because remember the context. We aren't practicing yoga for ourselves. We are practicing yoga for the divine, and it redounds to the credit of the world. So when we make a signal victory in ourselves, or annul the possibility of the distracting desire from carrying us afar, if we succeed in awakening allegiance from the various parts of our being, that becomes a template for success for others in the world, others who will come along with us or will follow afterwards. So your efforts at the practice of yoga tell upon the world. It is the difficulty of this wholesale conversion that is the source of all the stumblings in the path of yoga. For our entire nature and its environment, all our personal and all our universal self, are full of habits and of influences that are opposed to our spiritual rebirth and work against the wholeheartedness of our endeavor. In a certain sense, we are nothing but a complex mass of mental, nervous, and physical habits held together by a few ruling ideas, desires, and associations, an amalgam of many small self-repeating forces with a few major vibrations. This is the transient self. This is the thing that Buddha declares to be not us. When he says anatta, this is what he refers to. This constellation of forces, tendencies, elements of nature, etc., that the ego identifies with and clings to because this it knows to be itself or thinks to be itself, perceives to be itself. This is not us. He continues, what we propose in our yoga is nothing less than to break up the whole formation of our past and present, which makes up the ordinary material and mental man, and to create a new center of vision and a new universe of activities in ourselves, which shall constitute a divine humanity or a superhuman nature, an inner life centered on the soul, awakened, receptive to a transcendent power. The first necessity is to dissolve that central faith and vision in the mind, which concentrated on its development and satisfaction and interests in the old externalized order of things. It is imperative to exchange this surface orientation for the deeper faith and vision, which see only the divine and seek only after the divine. The next need is to compel all our lower being to pay homage to this new faith and greater vision. All our nature must make an integral surrender. It must offer itself in every part and every movement to that which seems to the unregenerated sense mind so much less real than the material world and its objects. Our whole being, soul, mind, sense, heart, will, life, body, must consecrate all its energies so entirely and in such a way that it shall become a fit vehicle for the divine. See, this is what she means by conversion. Integral surrender, turning inwards, living from there, called to the inner life more than to the outer. This is no easy task, for everything in the world follows the fixed habit which is to it a law and resists a radical change. And no change can be more radical than the revolution attempted in the integral yoga. Everything in us has constantly to be called back to the central faith and will and vision. Every thought and impulse has to be reminded in the language of the Upanishad that is the divine Brahman and not this which men here adore. That's the Kena Upanishad, and it's the refrain that runs from the 4th to the 8th verse, again and again. That is Brahman, not this which men here adore. Mind has to cease to be mind and become brilliant with something beyond it. Life has to change into a thing vast and calm and intense and powerful that can no longer recognize its old blind, eager, narrow self of petty impulse and desire. Even the body has to submit to a mutation and be no longer the clamorous animal or the impeding clod it now is, but become instead a conscious servant and radiant instrument and living form of the Spirit. And this reflects what he wrote in the Mother in chapter 6. It's interesting. Look at the beauty of this last phrase as he has revisioned the integral yoga. And note, this is how it ended previously in the Arya. But become instead a servant and a shadow of the soul. This is much more powerful. This is much more complete. The difficulty of the task has led naturally to the pursuit of easy and trenchant solutions. It has generated and fixed deeply the tendency of religions and of schools of yoga to separate the life of the world from the inner life. The powers of this world and their actual activities, it is felt, either do not belong to God at all, or are for some obscure and puzzling cause, Maya or another, a dark contradiction of the divine truth. And on their own opposite side, the powers of the truth and their ideal activities are seen to belong to quite another plane of consciousness than that, obscure, ignorant, and perverse in its impulses and forces, on which the life of the earth is founded. There appears at once the antinomy of a bright and pure kingdom of God and a dark and impure kingdom of the devil. We feel the opposition of our crawling earthly birth and life to an exalted spiritual God consciousness. We become readily convinced of the incompatibility of life's subjection to Maya with the soul's concentration in pure Brahman existence. The easiest way is to turn away from all that belongs to the one and to retreat by a naked and precipitous ascent into the other. Thus arises the attraction, and it would seem, the necessity of the principle of exclusive concentration, which plays so prominent a part in the specialized schools of yoga. For by that concentration, we can arrive through an uncompromising renunciation of the world at an entire self-consecration to the one on whom we concentrate. It is no longer incumbent on us to compel all the lower activities to the difficult recognition of a new and higher spiritualized life, and train them to be its agents or executive powers. It is enough to kill or quiet them, and keep at most the few energies necessary, on one side, for the maintenance of the body, and on the other, for communion with the divine. Well, this is the long story of what has been called Indian spirituality for the last couple of thousand years, starting with the Shramana tendencies in Buddhism and Jainism, which then gather force and begin to influence even the thought and spiritual practice of what was the Brahmanical faiths and orders of reality, orders of society, I should say. Such that if you wanted to practice the spiritual life, you had necessarily to put this world away from you. Well, it wasn't always so, because you know the tantric schools insisted on a practice that incorporated the world in it, but a world that was changed to accept the intextualization of what was in the tantric teachings. and not simply through personal practice, but also through collective practice. So the family, the kula, would be engaged in a far larger yoga than would be typically practiced by an individual who is attempting to arrive at self-realization apart from all the world around. For Sri Aurobindo, this way of excluding the world is from the beginning incorrect. And his acceptance and affirmation of the value of the world exceeds even that of the tantric teachings. So we'll see as we go what he means by that. The very aim and conception of an integral yoga debar us from adopting this simple and strenuous, high-pitched process. The hope of an integral transformation forbids us to take a shortcut or to make ourselves light for the race by throwing away our impedimenta, which means baggage or encumbrances, what obstructs, in other words. For we have set out to conquer all ourselves and the world for God. We are determined to give him our becoming as well as our being, and not merely to bring the pure and naked spirit as a bare offering to a remote and secret divinity in a distant heaven, or abolish all we are in a holocaust to an immobile absolute. The divine that we adore is not only a remote extra-cosmic reality, but a half-veiled manifestation present and near to us here in the universe. Life is the field of a divine manifestation, not yet complete. Here in life, on earth, in the body, ihaiva, as the Upanishads insist, we have to unveil the Godhead. Here, we must make its transcendent greatness, light, and sweetness real to our consciousness. Here, possess, and as far as may be, express it. Life, then, we must accept in our yoga in order utterly to transmute it. We are forbidden to shrink from the difficulties that this acceptance may add to our struggle. Our compensation is that even if the path is more rugged, the effort more complex and bafflingly arduous, yet after a certain point, we gain an immense advantage. For once our minds are reasonably fixed in the central vision, and our wills are on the whole converted to the single pursuit, life becomes our helper. Intent, vigilant, integrally conscious, we can take every detail of its forms and every incident of its movements as food for the sacrificial fire within us. Victorious in the struggle, we can compel Earth herself to be an aid towards our perfection, and can enrich our realization with the booty torn from the powers that oppose us. The idea expressed here, drawn from the Upanishads, ihaiva, iha and eva. What is really here, what verily is here, is what it means. At the close, he mentions the sacrificial fire. There is so much significance in that and so much yet to go through in this chapter that we'll reserve what could be a copious commentary for that. I've kept you a long time tonight. I'll keep you longer, and I'm going to read from Savitri. This is in Book 3, the Book of the Divine Mother, in the canto, The House of the Spirit and the New Creation, Canto 3. And we're on page 331. Alien now seemed that dim, far universe. Self and eternity alone were true. Then memory climbed to him from the striving plains, bringing a cry from once loved, cherished things, and to the cry as to its own lost call, a ray replied from the occult supreme. For even there the boundless oneness dwells. To its own sight unrecognizable, it lived still sunk in its own tenebrous seas, upholding the world's inconscient unity, hidden in matter's insentient multitude. This seed self, sown in the indeterminate, forfeits its glory of divinity, concealing the omnipotence of its force, concealing the omniscience of its soul. An agent of its own transcendent will, it merges knowledge in the inconscient deep. Accepting error, sorrow, death, and pain, it pays the ransom of the ignorant night, redeeming by its substance nature's fall. Himself he knew, and why his soul had gone into earth's passionate obscurity, to share the labor of an errant power, which by division hopes to find the one. Two beings he was, one wide and free above, one struggling, bound, intense, its portion here. A tie between them still could bridge two worlds. There was a dim response, a distant breath. All had not ceased in the unbounded hush. His heart lay somewhere, conscious and alone, far down below him like a lamp in night. Abandoned, it lay alone, imperishable, immobile with excess of passionate will. His living, sacrificed, and offered heart, absorbed in adoration mystical, turned to its far-off fount of light and love. In the luminous stillness of its mute appeal, it looked up to the heights it could not see. It yearned from the longing depths it could not leave. In the center of his vast and fateful trance, halfway between his free and fallen selves, interceding twixt God's day and the mortal's night, accepting worship as its single law, accepting bliss as the sole cause of things, refusing the austere joy which none can share, refusing the calm that lives for calm alone. To her it turned, for whom it willed to be. In the passion of its solitary dream, it lay like a closed, soundless oratory, where sleeps a consecrated argent floor, lit by a single and untrembling ray, and an invisible presence kneels in prayer. On some deep breast of liberating peace, all else was satisfied with quietude. This only knew there was a truth beyond. All other parts were dumb in centered sleep, consenting to the slow, deliberate power which tolerates the world's error and its grief, consenting to the cosmic long delay, timelessly waiting through the patient years her coming they had asked for earth and men. This was the fiery point that called her now. Extinction could not quench that lonely fire. Its seeing filled the blank of mind and will. Thought dead, its changeless force abode and grew. Armed with the intuition of a bliss to which some moved tranquility was the key, it persevered through life's huge emptiness amid the blank denials of the world. It sent its voiceless prayer to the unknown. It listened for the footsteps of its hopes, returning through the void immensities. It waited for the fiat of the word that comes through the still self from the Supreme. Namaste. Jai Ma.